Good evening and welcome to Tisky Sour. I'm Michael Walker, and tonight we are talking about, there's only one story in town at the moment. Everyone is talking about coronavirus. We are moving into the next stage of crisis management, or potentially not enough management. That's what a lot of people are suggesting. I am joined this evening by Aaron Bastani.
How you doing?
Co-founder of Novara Media.
Talk about crisis mismanagement.
Well, potentially. I'm going to caveat this actually with, obviously, neither me nor Aaron Bastani are epidemiologists. So we're not going to talk to you this evening saying we categorically know what the government should be doing, because we'd be pretending to know, right? But what we are going to do is we're going to talk you through the various evidence and disagreements that are going on in politics at the moment. Because obviously coronavirus is a bad thing, but I do like political stories that go on for a long time. Because what it means is that everyone actually has a chance to understand what the fuck's going on. When you've got stories that change every 2 days, people just have to pretend to know what's going on.
That's like World War II. It's like, by 1942, everybody understood the implications of full mobilisation. Everybody had their worked out. I'm
saying as a utilitarian, we shouldn't have had coronavirus. But what I'm saying is that if you've always got to look at the silver linings on the clouds, and we're all getting much better at epidemiology. Do you think that's true?
Yeah, it is true. It's true. I never thought in my adult life there would be a virus like this with the level of penetration and lethality. So, yeah, it's a surprise.
We are primarily going to be talking about, the government's announcements yesterday. Are they enough? What might they be missing? So we should start off with a video of Boris Johnson making that announcement. He was talking about Britain going from stage 1, which was contain. So the idea of the containment stage is you're trying to stop the virus spreading out into the general population, and we're moving to delay. That phase means that we've accepted that the virus is in the general population, but that we're going to try and slow down its spread. This is Boris Johnson yesterday.
Coronavirus, COVID-19, continues and will continue to spread across the world and our country over the next few months. We've done what can be done to contain this disease, and this has brought us valuable time, but it's now a global pandemic, and the number of cases will rise sharply. Indeed, the true number of cases is higher, perhaps much higher than the number of cases we have so far confirmed with tests. And I've got to be clear, we've all got to be clear, this is the worst public health crisis for a generation. Some people compare it to seasonal flu. Alas, that is not right. Owing to the lack of immunity, this disease is more dangerous, and it's going to spread further. And I must level with you, level with the British public. More families, many more families, are going to lose loved ones before their time. But as we've said over the last few weeks, we have a clear plan that we are now working through. And we're now getting on to the next phase in that plan, because this is now not just an attempt to contain the disease as far as possible, but to delay its spread and thereby minimize the suffering. From tomorrow, if you have coronavirus symptoms, however mild, either a new continuous cough or a high temperature, then you should stay at home for at least 7 days to protect others and help slow the spread.
That was Boris Johnson at a press conference yesterday. When I watched that, actually, obviously, I'm not particularly reassured whenever Boris Johnson tells me anything, but it was, I think, a political masterstroke that every time Boris Johnson comes out at the moment, he's flanked by the government's chief medical officer and the government's chief science officer, because then whenever there's a difficult question, he can pass it on to them, and it seems like, actually, maybe we are being led by, scientifically driven, evidence-based people. Which is definitely the impression they're trying to give. Actually, the press conference was, is quite explanatory in ways. I think the problem was that over the next 12 to 24 hours, it seemed like, actually, maybe there would have been some tougher questions that the journalists there should have asked when it became apparent that maybe whilst what they were suggesting in the short term sounded plausible, it wasn't necessarily enough. We should get up now, actually, what it means that we're now in delay phase. Is that some new measures are being implemented which weren't implemented before. And they are that, as you heard Boris Johnson say there, that if you've got a continuous cough or a fever, you should now self-isolate for 7 days. And also, They're advising those aged 70 or over not to go on cruises and advising against international school trips. Now, my response, and I think many people's response was like, aren't people doing that already? Like, I would have been quite surprised if up to yesterday there were still 70-year-olds with a mild fever going on a cruise ship, given that that's the seems to be the most common place to incubate and spread this disease.
I mean, are people still going abroad? I mean, I just find that kind of weird.
Well, what do you think? Do you think the advice is a bit lackadaisical? It's a bit late?
I don't know. I do agree with what you've said about them being overtaken by events, because they gave that interview, the sort of government set pieces looked very authoritative. They say things like, the Premier League will carry on as normal. We're going to have local elections. The Electoral Commission, first thing today, says, we don't think it's a good idea. Labour say, we don't think it's a good idea. I actually think Labour would have been, legitimate to boycott them if they were made to do them. It's clearly going to be a mass transmission of disease if you're knocking on people's doors, canvassing, etc., giving them electoral literature. And then the Tories pulled out. The Premier League season is suspended when Mikel Arteta, the Arsenal manager, got sick. So it does seem very ad hoc. So it's quite difficult to read what's really going on here. But like I say, in the set pieces, when they're talking to journalists at 10 Downing Street, the strategic communication side of things is very good. That said, the crisis is so unpredictable.
Yeah. They should be having those every day, by the way. Because I think a big point is when you're watching it, you feel like, oh, that kind of makes sense. But then you develop a load of questions over the next 12 hours, and then they're not willing to come out and answer any more questions.
To happen, right? It's like a war situation.
There should be daily press conferences, because the other worry I have, and we'll talk about this as the show goes on, is that one way the government seem to be avoiding scrutiny really is to just repeat ad nauseum that we're being led by the science. We're being led by the science. We're being led by the science. And what that ignores is that scientists disagree. And so obviously the public have a right to know why you're listening to that scientist and not that scientist. This will all become apparent as we continue our conversation. I want to bring up now a graphic from last night's Newsnight, which was largely shared as sort of evidence that what the government is proposing is quite out of step with lots of other European and North American countries. So you can see that they've made a graph, bunch of countries on the left, and on the top they're saying, are they closing schools? Are they closing restaurants? Are they closing sporting events? Are they closing mass gatherings? Are they implementing travel restrictions? And is there a domestic lockdown, as in people have to stay in their homes? The UK has done none of them, and all the other countries have done at least two of them, at least two or three of them at least three of them. All the other countries have done. So Britain is out of step.
I mean, it's only 11 countries, to be fair. That's not like, if you think like the whole of the European Union, EFTA states, North America, you're looking at like 35 countries. I'm sure there are some countries that are.
Well, there are also there are countries on there that are doing that aren't on there that are doing more as well, right?
No, but there are countries that are doing the same as us and they're not put on there. So I can understand the government sort of complaints about that because it's misrepresentative. You've only added countries there who are doing things we're not.
Well, what countries are doing? Because the country we're compared to the most in terms of the response is Germany, and from that graph, Germany are doing more than us.
You might compare us to, I don't know, Iceland. You might.
Well, what are Iceland doing? I've got no idea.
No, that's what I'm saying. We're an island. There's different sort of dynamics at work. I have no idea.
In any case,
but I can see. No, but I think Newsnight did a bit of a hatchet job with that thing, because you've only put the countries on there who are doing more than the UK. I have no idea Okay, so where does the UK? It's like having our GDP is really low, and then you only put countries which are wealthier, higher than us. Well, are there other countries below us? Maybe that's representative. The point is, I have no idea. I don't know what countries beyond those 11 or 12 are doing. I'm not here to bat for Boris Johnson, the Tories. I can understand why.
Well, so you've got
the BBC came in for the criticisms that it did.
So from looking at this, you've got the four biggest countries in the EU on there, and you've got the United States. There are obvious comparators to compare the United Kingdom to. I want to go on there because I want to talk about the principles that seem to be guiding the government's response. And
you've also got Malta there, though, Michael. Malta's like 300,000 people.
Yeah, so you think Malta's include? You think they're?
Well, I just don't know. It just seems
being disingenuous.
Bit of a weird thing to do. Anyway, I can understand why the government's upset with the BBC.
Yeah, so the government did get pissed off at Lewis Goodall. I think they called it Trumpian. That graph. But it's something that's undeniable is that the government aren't denying this, is that their response is kind of out of step with most other countries who are in a similar situation to us, who have a similar level of cases. Ireland, for example, has fewer cases than us per the population, and they've already closed schools, for example. So the government are being very explicit in the fact that they are taking a more relaxed approach to shutting stuff down. And a couple of the justifications for that and we can look at now. So one of them is behavioural science. So it's this idea, it is a bit sort of like the kind of stuff that gets put in books at airports. So it's this idea that you might think that a policy will do this thing, but actually, counterintuitively, it could have the opposite effect. So examples of this, you might think that shutting a school would mean that less people would get the virus, but actually if you shut the school, then the kids go home, then they hang out with their grandparents, and then their grandparents
Well, this stuff came out of a book, right? No, I mean, David Halpern wrote a book called Nudge, which is like airport reading, right? Freakonomics kind of stuff.
Exactly. And the Nudge, as we mentioned on Wednesday's show, the Nudge unit was created in 2010 to advise David Cameron. It was part of his big society. So it was the idea that the state doesn't have to do that much to achieve social policy outcomes. What it has to do is, little things to try and nudge people, which is why it's called Nudge, in the right direction. Yeah. And big things that the Nudge unit is famous for is sending out text messages to say you need to do your tax return. It actually works for me. That does make me do my tax return on time. But protecting the population from an epidemic is kind of different from trying to get people to return their tax forms on time.
They also do that thing where you put like a bee in a urinal and then people don't miss and they piss on the bee.
Because they're aiming. Yeah.
That's a nudge.
Yeah. So that's the kind of... We're talking about different levels of seriousness, and the costs of if it fails are slightly bigger in this case.
Well, no, but they would say, look, every year the economy spends £150 million on cleaning toilets, and that could be saved through this tiny, behavioural change.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, I think I've got no problem with them putting bees and spiders in urinals. I think which means that you target your piss. But I don't necessarily think that should be qualification for then managing...
That is honestly one of the most famous examples. I'm not sort of saying that to belittle the Nudge unit.
The other, so we'll go through behavioural science or those aspects of it in a bit more detail. Also, the other one is epidemiology, and this is, I think, the more serious argument, which is to say that if you have a lockdown, so what other countries are doing is trying to have quite serious social distancing measures already to try and stop people catching the disease from people who have it, especially people who have it and don't know they have it. What the government are saying is that actually we don't want to stop everyone getting the disease because we need enough people to get the disease, enough young, healthy people to get the disease, that society develops some herd immunity. I want to stick with the behavioural science first. This is the idea that if you take what seem like obviously good measures, it could have unintended consequences. So someone who explained this morning was the chief scientist, Sir Patrick Vallance, on Radio 4. We can get up the Carol Cadwallader tweet of it, which is that he was saying, he was asked, all these other countries are cancelling huge sporting events. If, as you said, the chief scientist said yesterday that there might be 10,000 people in the population that have coronavirus and don't know, or 500 or so people know they've got it. So it could be 10,000 people who have it. So say, if we know that this many people have coronavirus, why are we encouraging people to go into these big spaces and hang out together when Ireland, when France are not doing that, when they've cancelled it? And what Patrick Vallance said is that actually, look, if you cancel the rugby match, which is outdoors, so there is some chance that people will catch it, but it's better that they're outdoors, they would watch it in the pub. And if they're watching it in a pub, you've got a closed space, you've got a warm closed space. It's like lots of capacity for passing on the illness. It's one of those things where the moment he says it, it sounds reasonable. Then you think for 5 seconds, you're like, well, what if you just cancelled the match?
People are going to still watch the match in pubs as well.
Well, exactly.
So none of it happens if you cancel the match.
What do people do before they go to a rugby match? They go to the pub. What do they do afterwards? They go to the pub. And how do they get there and back? On incredibly packed trains or buses or whatever. So,
and when you go into the stadium, you're patted down, etc.
Yeah, and to be honest, a lot of when I hear them talk about these behavioural science, but if you did this, something else would happen. It does sound a bit weak. It's sort of like if you tell people not to go into school, then people won't be able to work in the health service because they'll be looking after their kids. Well, there's an easy fix to that. What if you say school will only be open for people who work, for the children of people who do essential jobs, and then you tell everyone else that they can stay off work?
I think that's wise.
I mean, it's sort of like that's a simple fix. So instead of saying we're not going to close the schools because then healthcare workers might have to take time off work, so we're just not going to do it. We're just not going to bother at all. Yeah. If you said, okay, well, that is a genuine problem, we should accept that.
Yeah.
So what
logistics workers, social care workers. So
what should you do? Say school is only for people whose parents do essential jobs, and everyone who's not doing an essential job is welcome to miss work and stay home and look after their kids. I think that's what Hong Kong did. But let's look now at herd immunity, because we've got another video related to this as well. So that's the behavioural science aspect. It's saying that the reason Britain are doing things differently to other countries is because we are better at behavioural science than them. So whilst France might think they're doing a smart thing in terms of banning sporting events, actually the French people are just going to gather in pubs and give it to themselves there. I mean, Belgium have banned pubs being open, so I don't think it's a particularly strong argument. The other argument the government are making is about epidemiology. It's a study of the spread of diseases, and in particular herd immunity. So what they're saying is if we shut down society too early, if we lock people in their homes, then by the time when we let them out, because not many people will have ever had the disease and not many people will have become immune to it, then at that point you'll get a second epidemic, just as big as the potential first one, and maybe next winter. So sort of in an unideal time. It's quite a complex idea. And the best I've seen it explained was yesterday on Newsnight by Professor Graham Madley. So he's a professor of infectious disease modelling at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and academic chair of the Scientific Pandemic Influenza Group on Modelling. So a guy with many credentials to his name.
This virus is going to be with us for a long time. We're going to have an epidemic, and then it will become endemic and join in with all the other coronaviruses that we all have all the time but don't notice. We're going to have to generate what we call herd immunity. So that's a situation where the majority of the population are immune to the infection. And the only way of developing that in the absence of a vaccine is for the majority of the population to become infected. Ideally, if I could, what I would like to do is to put all the more vulnerable people into the north of Scotland and keep them there, everybody else into Kent, and have a nice big epidemic in Kent so that everyone becomes immune, and then we can put people back together again. But we can't do that. So what we're going to have to try and do, ideally, is some kind of manage this acquisition of herd immunity and minimise the exposure of people who are vulnerable.
So clearly a very intelligent guy, and the point he's making is that, you know, what we want to happen to damage or to limit the deaths that happen from coronavirus, and to limit, you know, the government seem to be quite concerned about inconvenience or economic damage. We'll talk about that later as well. But what you want is for you to develop herd immunity by enough young, healthy people getting it, and then recovering from it, and then being immune from it, that, you know, society becomes as a collective less liable to epidemics.
What does the antibodies thing mean? Like the production of antibodies?
Well, so
is that something separate to immunity?
No, I think immunity. No, I think you have immunity because you've got the antibodies.
Right.
So if you've had the virus, or
but
you've had the cold virus,
can you have antibodies but not be immune? So like, there's some development of antibodies within the population, and they might get it, but it's not as bad. Or
I think
we should be explaining this, shouldn't we? That's what we're meant to be doing.
Well, no, I mean it's early days in terms of what they understand about coronavirus, but obviously what's motivating this guy, who seems to know a lot about disease control, and what most people are suggesting is that you can't get it twice. So if you've had coronavirus and recovered, I mean, it's the same with a cold, actually. I think you can't get the same cold twice.
Or measles, chickenpox.
Yeah. So I mean, it's kind of like what the government want is, you know, some people have chickenpox parties because you want your kids. Well, yeah, because with chickenpox, it's bad when you're an adult. It's fine when you're a kid.
Right.
So what some parents do is there's one kid in this class or in the friendship group who has chickenpox, and then they send all the kids to have a party with the kid with chickenpox so they can get chickenpox and become immune to it. Because once if you haven't had it as a child, you might get it as an adult, and if you get it as an adult, it's a serious problem. So I
didn't even know that.
It's sort of it's a similar idea to that, but the problem is one that you don't want everyone, even though you ultimately want a large proportion of the healthy population to get it, you don't want them all to get it at the same time, because that could overwhelm the health system for those people for whom the disease does become serious. The other problem, and I think this is the major one, is that he has sort of, this seems to be the model guiding the government. But even though the government can't do what he has hypothetically suggested, which is to put all the older people in the north of Scotland and all the younger people in Kent to share the coronavirus around there, they don't seem to have done, obviously they can't do that, but they don't seem to have done anything really to separate younger people who they don't seem to mind getting coronavirus from older people. So, you know, they haven't suggested how they are going to.
But also, how certain are we? I mean, how certain are we that people don't get coronavirus twice?
From what I've read, they seem fairly confident. I mean, it would be insane for them to have developed this whole
No, I know.
policy system if they didn't have some
the claims
confidence
are
about that.
its mutations are very slow, etc. So there's not very many concerns about that. But I mean, again, if there was a mutated version, could that compromise somebody's immune system if they'd had, the other variant, etc.?
Potential. I mean, I haven't seen many people complain. So as I was saying, because we're not epidemiologists, we're going to be talking about the various debates that people are having who
we're
know about this
synthesizing
shit.
the information.
Yeah.
We're journalists.
And as far as I can tell, there aren't any, big dog credible scientists saying our big concern with this strategy is that actually people maybe can get coronavirus twice, 3 times, 4 times. No one said it's completely stupid. They've just said it's potentially riskier than it would need to be. As we said, we're synthesizing information. We're going to go to now someone who is a genuine expert. So he was on Newsnight last night, very, very intelligent fella. Anthony Costello. He is an ex-director of the World Health Organization, and he's not so sure about this strategy. He's not sure about the government strategy to let all the young people get coronavirus so that we develop some sort of herd immunity. This is what he says. We can get his thread up. So he says, unlike other countries, the UK strategy aims to build herd immunity by allowing the steady spread of COVID-19. The government argue it will block a second peak in several months' time. Here are 8 questions about this herd immunity strategy. 1. Will it impair efforts to restrict the immediate epidemic and cause more infections and deaths in the near term? Evidence suggests people shed virus early, and those without symptoms may cause substantial spread. This argues for policies against mass gatherings, for school closures, and for strict national and local measures for social distancing. So there he's doubting this idea that current government policies are going to mean that it spreads through the population slowly, because he's saying actually, given current policies, it could get out of control really, really quickly. 2, he's saying, will it weaken containment systems, testing, screening, radiography, isolation? China built a robust nationwide system of mobilised community workers for identifying cases promptly, isolating contacts and treating vulnerable people promptly to contain the outbreak. So he's saying that what China did is they were actually, they tried to contain the virus, and they did that by making sure they knew who had it, making sure people who needed treatment got it very quickly, and making sure, younger healthy people with coronavirus didn't go and give it to older people. And the government don't seem to be implementing many of those measures. 3, does coronavirus cause strong herd immunity, or is it like flu where new strains emerge each year needing repeat vaccines? We have to learn much about COV immune responses. That's actually referring to what you were talking about, Aaron. So he is saying that we don't know enough that you couldn't develop a slightly different strain of coronavirus, and then whilst we're all immune to the current strain of COVID-19, you could get COVID-19. I know it's not how it works, but COVID-19.5, and then you're able to get that.
I mean, the point is, if 40% of the global population gets it, statistically, it's quite likely there's going to be a mutation, surely. I mean, I know they're saying it mutates very slowly. You get degrees of mutation and different sort of velocities, etc., with regards to different viruses. But I mean, if 40% of 7.5 billion people get it, there's going to be mutations, presumably. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I'd say the main argument there is that, and I think his conclusion we'll get to in a moment, is that even we don't know at the moment, right? And we don't have a high degree of certainty, and so why take this incredibly high-risk strategy? 4, he says, doesn't this herd immunity strategy conflict with WHO policy, World Health Organization policy? After the announcements of this being a pandemic, Dr. Tedros, Director General of the WHO, said the idea that countries should shift from containment to mitigation is wrong and dangerous. So this is the idea that the government have now said, fuck it, everyone can get it. We'll just try and make it as least disastrous as possible.
Wait, so repeat that line again?
So what, from the Director General of the WHO, he said, the idea that countries should shift from containment to mitigation is wrong and dangerous.
From containment to mitigation. The thing is, we had the Harvard professor of epidemiology, Mark Lipsitch, said that 40 to 70% of the global population is going to get it in the medium term, in the next couple of years. That's been repeated by Fraulein Angela Merkel, probably the most sober, serious, honest politician sort of amongst the major European politicians. So, I mean, how do you contain that? I understand the containment strategy in so much as you only have so much healthcare capacity, so many hospital beds, so you don't want to overburden that system all in one go. But in terms of actually containing the virus so that not many people get it, I mean, I don't see how that, are they sort of insinuating there that it can be contained until there's a vaccine within the next 12 to 18 months, or what? Do we shut down the global economy for 18 months?
Well, so I suppose what
that's what the Tories are refusing to do effectively, right? They don't want to shut down the economy to
the WHO have been
minimise
very, if you read their reports, they've been very complimentary about how China and Taiwan and South Korea have dealt with it. And they've dealt with it by saying, we just need to stop this virus dead and take quite serious action to make sure that doesn't happen, pour tons and tons of resources in it. You had, I think, 40,000 people went from different regions of China to work in Wuhan. So you had a mobilisation of resources, which is completely unheard of in the European countries, which is why they were quite effective at stopping the spread. And that does just give people more time to understand what's going on.
No, I get that. But the second Wuhan goes back to business as usual, let's say in 2 months, and then you have tourists there, and you have the spread of infection, you have social institutions like schools, workplaces open again, it's going to happen all over again.
That's the government's argument.
I'm not saying I agree. Can I just say I'm not saying I agree with the government, but it might be that maybe in terms of if you're from a utilitarian perspective, you want to absolutely minimise deaths. You say, look, we're just going to have to shut down society for 12 months, 18 months until there's a vaccination. I get that, but the WHO, by attacking or people who are disagreeing, people in positions of power and knowledge with regards to the healthcare profession, disagreeing with the government, that seems to be their implicit argument, but nobody's actually saying that.
Well, so his next tweet kind of answers you, which is helpful. So he says, shouldn't we wait to see the China situation? They've contained the epidemic after 7 weeks of intense national effort. Will their strengthened systems not contain outbreaks quickly? What is their herd immunity? We don't have, I don't even know what serology available yet means, but it might be substantial. So he's saying, look, potentially it will be the case that China get a second burst of it. And maybe next time around, they'll have to go for a strategy which looks like what the government's current strategy is. But why would we not wait to see? Which kind of makes sense to me. Number 6, without an all-out national mobilisation plan for social distancing, are the UK government behavioural and nudge strategies really evidence-based to flatten the peak or simply based on models? And on the precautionary principle, shouldn't we go all out to snuff this UK epidemic out with national mobilisation at all levels, using all possible preventative measures, whether evidence is strong, uncertain or weak, and worry about herd immunity when we have more evidence?
Can we freeze that for a sec? So, again, the question would be, isn't there an opportunity cost? So if you're deploying those kinds of resources, if you're shutting down parts of the economy to such an extent that you can do that, to what extent are healthcare workers? We've got 4 million people in this country waiting for operations. We've got people who've got cancer, onset cancer, and they need to have that cancer removed. We've got elderly people who need just care. They need to be, looked after and, cleaned and visited, etc. So, you might have some people who are suicidal. They have mental health care workers they need to see, etc. So, there's an opportunity cost. If you deploy all of these human resources into this one thing, do you see what I'm saying?
I see what you said. Well, I suppose,
again, why is there not that sort of that conversation?
Well, so, and this is where I worry, actually, because what you're saying is we could make a decision as a society that we're willing to take the risk, and we're willing to take the risk because the economic costs and the costs not related to coronavirus of implementing a shutdown at this point in time would be too high, so we might as well risk a few people's lives.
Well, I said there's 2 alternatives. That's one of them. The other one is you literally shut down the running of the modern economy, which means under neoliberalism society, basically people don't leave their houses. You only have absolutely, critically important jobs carrying on, etc. And then you say, well, we're just going to wait for a vaccine in 12 to 18 months. And yeah, we're going to take a contraction of GDP by 25, 35%. Those, to me, seem the 2 things you do.
No, so I'd say there's a middle ground, right? So a middle ground would be, say what places like Taiwan are doing, or even what Italy is doing in a way, is so you implement quite extreme social distancing measures, and then you could, in a graduated way, bring life back to normal and see how it goes. So if you implement social distancing measures at this point, then potentially you could say, oh, actually, well, we were never confining health workers to their homes anyway. We were never confining a bunch of people who work in essential services to their homes. Then sort of like, if it seems like you've got it under control, then you let this part of the economy start again. You let this part of society start again, and you do it slowly in a controlled manner. So you're fairly confident that you're not going to get that overwhelming spike where you have exponential increases.
Well, no, it's not. That may be the case, but like I said, the government is saying we'll take this, as Boris Johnson so charmingly puts it, on the chin. That's not a known solution. It seems to me there are 2 quite plausible solutions with high sort of degrees of certainty as to what they would mean. So the government's sort of conclusion here is, yeah, things will carry on. Maybe 200,000 to 400,000 people will die. That's what they're doing. And then you could say, look, you know what? We want to keep deaths down to 50,000 or below. This is what we're going to do. The economy takes a hit. This thing in the middle, it might work, it might not work. You'll have economic contraction. Then you go back to life to normal. Then you have economic contraction again. I mean...
But the government haven't been honest about saying that what we're willing to accept is 200 to 4,000
That's what I mean.
400,000
That's
people
what I
dying.
mean.
Because what they're suggesting is that this herd immunity will actually mean less older people die. Because they're saying that if you just keep having wave after wave after wave, the older people will die. But what they haven't suggested is how they're going to separate the old people, et cetera, et cetera. We'll just go to the final one, and then I want to go to a graph. So the final tweet: vaccines are a safer way to develop herd immunity without the risks associated with the disease itself. Is it ethical to adopt a policy that threatens immediate casualties on the basis of an uncertain future benefit? And I want to get out this graph because this graph was, again, on Newsnight. They said they got it from The Lancet. And I think this really just helps you understand all the different theories. So this is it up on the screen now? So we've got the red graph, or the red line, sorry. It's showing you on the y-axis, you've got cases being reported. On the x-axis, you've got months since transmission established. So this red line, that's showing if you get exponential growth and the virus gets out of control, and 60% of society get it all at one time. Obviously, you don't want that because health services get overwhelmed. There's not much opportunity to protect older and more vulnerable citizens. We should also know it's not just older people, it's also people with disabilities or people with suppressed immune systems. If it all happens that quickly, there's no time to protect the vulnerable, fundamentally.
Well, also society just collapses, right? You can't run supply chains, transport links. If 1 in 4 people is sick or something.
Well, so
isn't that their main? I thought that was the main concern, that you basically can't maintain public order and sort of the reproduction of society.
No, so the main concern with the red line is that loads of people die.
Obviously. But the point of it all being at once is
even all being at once is probably better for the economy, because this Boris Johnson said this.
I'm not saying the economy. I'm saying like public order, and you might have rioting, looting, etc.
Well, probably. I mean, what you'd have is you'd have lots of old people dying, and you'd have lots of people.
I'm not saying dying, but people contracting it. I'm not saying dying.
Yeah, but
most people survive.
Why are people contracting it going to riot? I mean,
because
if you do the red thing,
supply chains collapse. You can't access food.
But supply chains, because basically, if you do no controls,
1 in 4 police disappear. Nurses, teachers.
But the whole point is 1 in 4 police wouldn't disappear. The only people who are going to die are people who
dying. I'm saying contracting it.
Yeah, but if you contract it and you
have to be isolated.
No, but you would. So in the red phase, people aren't being isolated. So that's the whole point,
right?
So we could just decide that we're going to let it continue. All the young and healthy people, who are the people who form, the basis of the labour force anyway, they can continue with a few sniffles and a bit of a cough. Some people barely notice they've got it. The economy would continue as it had been, and then a bunch of people who are economically inactive anyway die. Right. So that would be the sort of like ultimate neoliberal capitalist. We value capital and we value wealth over everything else. That's what you do. You wouldn't have any controls whatsoever. The green option is to say you slow it down. So you slow down the spread. So ultimately, again, you're looking at sort of 60 to 70% of the population getting it before they develop herd immunity. But you slow it down with measures like social isolation, and then that means that the health service is never overwhelmed. You have the chance to sort of separate older people and more vulnerable people from the ill population, and then you limit casualties. That's the green one. And then the blue one, this is what the government are saying they want to avoid. So the blue one is when you get a few cases, that's when you have absolute lockdown. So you have absolute lockdown, cases go down to 0, but then because you can't lock people in their homes forever, you have to let them out again. And the moment you let them out, there is still coronavirus around, either because some people still have it in the community or because there's still a global pandemic going on. And then because no one's got herd immunity, you then get another epidemic situation. So the point being that all those months that you spent locked down were pointless. Or if it turns out that your second boost is in the winter, then it could be that all that lockdown was actively unhelpful.
Let me just say, just to respond to some of the things in the comments, I think if you had the scenario with the red line, you'd have to have martial law. That's just my view. You'd have so many fatalities. You'd have prison. I mean, you'd already seen prison riots in Italy with a far lower level of cases being reported per head of population. I just don't. I think you'd have to have martial law. I think that's one of the considerations for government policy on this is public order.
I just don't agree, because I mean I think the prison riots probably has a lot to do with the fact that people are Well, I mean, it depends how old the people are in the prisons. I mean, ultimately, if you let the red thing happen, then most of people of rioting age, most of people of working age are going to be absolutely fine. I mean, the human cost is massive for older people and people with suppressed immune system, but they're not your standard rioters and they're not your standard people.
We're looking statistically at more people. You're more likely to die from this thing than you would have been as the average UK national, the average person walking around per head, per capita, than you would have been fighting in the Second World War. So, you're looking. No, that's hold on. But you front load all of that, several 100,000 casualties, people being upset, supply chains being massively disrupted, etc. I just don't. I think clearly the state would think this may be a big public order consideration.
It'd be very unpopular.
The idea that things would be there wouldn't be mass dissent against the government, there wouldn't be mass protests, supply chains wouldn't be disrupted, there wouldn't be prison riots, wouldn't be riots to access healthcare. Come on, you'd have martial law.
I think what you'd get is you'd have a very unpopular government because so many people would die. But the people don't. I mean, are people going to riot because people are dying from coronavirus? I don't know, because when you go and riot, you're more likely to get it.
Anyway, we disagree. I think that's probably a consideration for the government not adopting the red line strategy. I could disagree.
I mean, I think we live. Who wants all of those people to die? I mean, I think them. Well, I mean, I think the other danger is that the government maybe have adopted the red line strategy. So that's the fear. So we'll so the blue. We've talked about the blue line. So disagreements about the government response are fundamentally the government say they're on the green line and they're avoiding the blue line, which is what they say countries like Taiwan, who've had a more shut down system, are doing. But then what people like, I've forgotten his name already, the Anthony Costello, so he was the guy who was the next director of the World Health Organization. What they're saying is actually, this is fine in theory, but what the government have implemented would actually put us on the red line. Because he's saying if you've got 10,000 people who currently have coronavirus in this country and you're not really doing anything to separate anyone, then you are very close to getting to this completely overwhelming outbreak. So he's saying the government are putting us, or the government are definitely risking putting us on the red line. And given that, if you're looking at this graph and you say, what's the best outcome, the green line? What's the worst outcome is the red line. So then you thought you'd aim somewhere between the green line and the blue line. And the British government seems to be aiming somewhere between the green line and the red line. So
can I ask you, given that their voter base is older voters, why would they be front-loading several 100,000 deaths almost on purpose?
Yeah, so that's what seems very... I mean, this Chris Giles, I think, from the FT was tweeting precisely that. He was saying, even if hypothetically this makes sense, there's a sort of time lag. So it could be that in 2 years, we look back at the government policy and say, that was kind of clever, because whilst we had more deaths in spring 2020, France had more deaths in spring 2021. But the point is, and this is what Chris Giles, this is, I think, economics editor at the Financial Times, he was saying that if we have a period where, because France is in lockdown, they have 500 deaths in April, and because we don't have lockdown, we have 2,000 deaths in lockdown, 2,000 deaths in UK, then the government are going to struggle to continue with that particular policy, right? Yeah. So there is a concern. So you're right, front-loading the deaths could be a big problem.
A strategic comms nightmare. Look, tell the political editor of the Daily Mail, look, give it 6 months, actually.
More deaths now for less deaths later. It's never been a particularly good slogan, especially when the whole idea that there's going to be less deaths later is somewhat disputed. Let's go to a clip. This is someone else who knows what he's talking about. This is John Ashton. So he's the former director for Public Health England, for the northwest of England. So he was on Question Time last night, and he was sort of expressing this idea that what the government are doing is so relaxed that they are going to put us into an uncontrolled epidemic situation, or, referring to that graph, the red line.
I don't know where to start, really. I mean, I'm embarrassed by the situation in this country. This talk of 4 stages, and we're now, moving on from the containment thing. We've lost the plot here. We haven't taken the action that we should have taken 4 or 5 weeks ago.
So what do you think we should have done?
Boris Johnson should have convened COBRA at the outset when it became clear what was cooking up. Countries that took firm action at the time, if you look at what's happened in Hong Kong and Singapore, which had a lot of cases initially, but which took firm action, and they've got the thing under control. We've lost control here. Last night, I didn't go to Anfield last night because, I had such second thoughts about it. 3,000 supporters came to Anfield last night from Madrid, where they're playing football behind closed doors. The virus is around in Madrid. We've had that virus has been shared around Merseyside last night in the bars and clubs of Merseyside. The virus is no doubt now among us for reasons which are totally obscure to me. We've taken it as policy not to track the people who've come back from Italy, not to test the people who've come back from Italy. So the virus will now be amongst us. And the government's approach has been paternalistic, it's been old-fashioned, it's been top-down, and it's not done what needs to happen now, and we've lost 4 or 5 weeks, which if we get the epidemic that looks like happening, then it's going to be a community issue to be dealt with by the community. And the community needed to be put in the driving seat and supported, because there's no way in which very sick people are all going to be able to be admitted to hospital. They will have to be nursed at home.
That was John Ashton talking about how the government had been worryingly relaxed. We're going to talk a bit in a moment about how the government's relaxed approach means that many people are taking the initiative themselves. Many big public-facing organisations are saying we're going to go ahead of the government advice because we're not sure it's effective. But first of all, you're watching Tiski's Hour, you're watching Novara Media. As you know, this show is only possible because of your kind support. I mean, if we go on lockdown, we're going to need to up our ability to do these shows on Skype potentially. You know, if we have to do them all sitting in different rooms, which is going to involve a bit more technology.
So if you come in suits, no?
Oh, in what they call
hazard suits.
Hazard suits.
What are they called? Hazard suits? I was talking about this.
That's what I thought it was. Hazmat suits. Yeah, maybe we need to invest in those. Anyway, we could
little mics
we could do with Novara Media could do with a little financial cushion to deal with the coronavirus outbreak, and we're not going to get it from any of the billionaires or the millionaires or the government because we can talk in a critical way without worrying about anyone stopping the cash flow, because people like you give us, hopefully, the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. If you are a subscriber, thank you very much. You can also, and you should also, find the link to the show tweet under the YouTube video. If you retweet that will send more people in the direction of this show. Keep your comments coming. Like the video. 282 of you have liked it. There are 1,300 of you watching this evening, so give that a like. It doesn't cost you anything and you can't catch anything. Right, let's talk about how...
If we get 1,000 likes, what will we do? Let's say, look, if you give us 1,000 likes, what will you do for our audience tonight, Michael?
What will I do?
Yeah. Can't be anything obscene. We don't want to get, the video taken down.
I don't know. What do you think I should do? Put it in the comments. What would you like to see if you get 1,000? And it has to be something that doesn't increase my risk of getting coronavirus.
Or being arrested.
Yep. I'm on the straight and narrow these days.
Smash the like button and let's get something, let's get Michael to do something stupid. Or just interesting.
Let's look at how big public institutions are going ahead of the government. So one of them is care homes. So I was saying before, sort of like this idea that you put a cocoon around the old and vulnerable while everyone else gets it. Works in theory. In practice, the government don't seem to have done anything really to protect the vulnerable and the elderly. Actually, let's just go to a couple of paragraphs from this Guardian article. So it says, care homes across the country are banning visits from friends and family and keeping residents indoors in an effort to stem the spread of coronavirus. The government has not told care providers to shut their doors to all non-essential visits, but the former Health Secretary Jeremy Hunt, chair of the Commons Health and Social Care Committee, told BBC Newsnight on Thursday he was personally surprised that we're still allowing external visits to care homes. Mario Creft, the chair of Care Forum Wales, which represents more than 450 care and nursing homes, advised people on Thursday morning to stay away. He said, simply put, not visiting care homes is likely to save people's lives. You've got, an example here of whilst the government, have provided their rationale for being incredibly relaxed about social distancing, people are getting conflicting advice because not everyone buys that. So even if they are correct, they haven't explained it well enough that people in positions of influence are buying it. A similar one we've spoke about before was that the government didn't cancel sporting events and the Premier League did. So the government said, it's fine, people can go there, otherwise they'll watch it in pubs. The Premier League got together and cancelled the whole league. within 12 hours of the government saying there's no need to do that. Same with the rugby, which was actually the clip that the chief scientist was talking about on Radio 4. He was saying that morning it's not necessary to cancel the rugby match. By the afternoon, the rugby match has been cancelled, not by the government, but by people taking their own initiative. Now, this might seem...
that's happening a lot. Like, also, Paul Pogba's saying dab. See that?
Yeah, he's saying dab instead of shake your hands. I'm worried about the arm that goes over there, though, because what if you've got some germs on that and then you sort of
that's true. You might
someone's
touch somebody.
face?
That's true.
So I think you should do more of
it's kind of weird.
More of a sort of like protective dab.
Paul Pogba and his Instagram account are actually offering better advice to stem coronavirus than the British government.
As is your man... I mean, my football knowledge is really bad. What's the Liverpool manager's name?
Oh, Jurgen Klopp.
Jurgen Klopp. He's been very, very good on coronavirus because obviously the league has been suspended. People are worried, not worried, but people are like, oh, this must suck for Liverpool who are just about to win it. He's like, the only thing that matters is people go home and look after themselves and look after their families. Very, very, very different tone to Boris Johnson.
I've seen some journalists say, oh, I love this guy so much. Some journalists that work at News International. Go see what he said about the Sun newspaper.
What did he say about the Sun newspaper?
He won't ever give an interview to the Sun newspaper. Good guy.
This all might seem, this is all innocent enough. I mean, there's one example of people going ahead of government advice that is, it's fair to say, pretty outrageous because of the duplicity of it all. It will become apparent what I mean. So if you read the Daily Mail this morning and you read their leader, they said, striking the right tone at the press conference was not easy, but Boris and his boffins carried it off well. At this stage, we must trust their gut judgment and do as they say. So that's the Daily Mail saying, this is what you should do is follow exactly what Boris Johnson has said. The government are completely right on this. However, the Daily Mail behind closed doors, what they emailed to their staff members was the global position. So this was Daily Mail's head of HR to all staff. The global position is moving so fast that the official government advice is no longer adequate enough to safeguard our staff. So there you've got a paper who's telling their million plus readership that everything's fine and what the government is telling you is brilliant and you should just follow all of their advice because it's great. And then so the advice is good enough for their readers, but the advice isn't good enough for their staff.
Isn't it like the third most read English-speaking news outlet in the world after like the BBC and the NYT?
Online it is, yeah. So online it is. I don't know if that leader was...
I mean, that's kind of nuts when you think about it, like that level of hypocrisy.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't know if I don't think their leaders do particularly well online. I imagine that's more the people who... to be honest, the people who read the Daily Mail especially actually are precisely the people who are more likely to die from coronavirus because it's got very old readership. So the older readership are being told, take all of the government advice, it's great. And then the younger staff members who are actually, presumably more likely to be of an age group where they're not going to die of coronavirus, they're all told like, nah, actually the government advice seems a bit behind where it should be. And I mean, that level of duplicity is a bit, bit dodge.
Well, we're not fans of the Daily Mail, are we?
Let's talk about some other media coverage of it. The media coverage, I think, has been fairly uncritical in a way.
In the US, it's been good. In Vox and Atlantic, I've learned so much from Vox and Atlantic. Vox, not Fox. Sorry.
I've actually learned a lot from News. Like Newsnight, I've had some really good interviews on.
I'm not including the BBC. I'm not including the BBC. But apart from The Guardian and the BBC, I've not read a single thing anywhere in the British media which I thought, yeah, okay, I feel like I've learned something there.
Yeah. I feel like some of the information they're giving is fine. What I think, many parts of the BBC and other journalists are doing is failing to hold the government to proper scrutiny. There are lots of questions that need to be asked and they don't necessarily seem to be asking them. I think that's because they've gone into this mode where, look, it's a national emergency. What we have to do is convert ourselves into spokespeople of the government. I mean, as we talk about on this show, they do that quite a lot anyway. But they seem to have gone into overdrive. I want to show this video. It's only 20 seconds long. So the BBC did a sort of question and answer session of how should you respond to coronavirus, common questions about the disease and the government response to it. So you're now going to see Palab Ghosh, who is one of their science correspondents, answer a question about why the government haven't closed schools.
The modelling shows that this isn't a good way of controlling the spread of the virus. In fact, it has many downsides. The largest of which is the fact that parents will have to stay at home. That damages the economy, and also a lot of those parents are key NHS staff, so it's a bad idea at this stage.
I mean, what I thought was strange about that is that it's the way he said, it's the right thing to do. Closing schools would be a bad idea. But that's not an uncontroversial statement. So lots of other countries have got scientific advice which suggests that closing a school is a good idea. And what he's done there, instead of, as a journalist, you should explain there's actually different ideas about this. So some people are saying, don't close the school because then the kids will have to go home, and then that will, what he said, that will cause economic damage, which is a bit taboo to say that we're, allowing people to die because of economic damage, but he sort of let the cat out of the bag there. But in any case, I just think the fact that he is just being a mouthpiece for the government is a bit odd.
Yeah, the whole thing about, we need to listen to the science. Obviously, we want to get epidemiologists on, and we want to get people who are versed in public healthcare policy on, et cetera, et cetera. We want to do all of that. But also, firstly, every person has a right to an opinion on this, because the government's policy in dealing with a public health crisis will impact their lives, and they vote for governments. That's the first thing. You don't need to have a PhD in epidemiology to have a legitimate opinion on whether or not the government's doing what it should be doing. Secondly, policy is political. Okay, so when people say, we have to listen to the science, let's look at, the natural laws of physics. If I drop an apple from a tree, as Isaac Newton found out, it hits the floor. We know that gravity is determined by, the speed at which it will fall to the floor is determined by the gravitational mass of the planet and the mass of the apple falling, etc. These are facts. These can't be disputed. What can be disputed is, okay, well, in this context, will this policy work? Who are being prioritized? What are the who are the stakeholders that are sort of getting more out of this than other people? What interests are trying to influence policy outcomes, in their respective ways? I mean, that's the job of the journalist, like you say. So there's this idea that it's government policy is operating in this vacuum of pure science with objective empirical fact. That's not how it works.
Yeah, and that wasn't journalism. That was a public service.
No,
announcement
it was public relations.
I remember the point I was going to make, which is that I was reading and this is in terms of why I'm a bit worried about. As I say, I don't claim to be an expert. I'm not going to tell you whether or not schools should be closed. But one thing that I thought was a bit worrying is I was looking today through the official government advice for people who are self-quarantining, and what it said is that it was telling you all of these things. Ideally, if you're self-quarantining because you've got a fever or a continuous cough or whatever, you should try and self-isolate from the rest of the family, because that's where you're most likely to spread the disease. Is as the chief scientist quite rightly said, it's not a football match; it's to people in your own home. So saying ideally stay in a different room to the rest of the family. Ideally have food sort of delivered to your door. Ideally use a different toilet. Then obviously they had to include loads of different qualifications, because that's in the ideal circumstance, and often you might live in a studio flat, you might not be able to go in a different room. Many people only have one toilet. I mean, I only have one toilet. Most, it's very common. But also if you're a single parent, for example, there's no way you can isolate yourself from the kids living in the home, because the kids living in the home need you to look after them. And what this says, what the official government advice says, is that if you've got all the symptoms of coronavirus and you're doing your normal parental activities with your child, which means there's an incredibly high chance that your child becomes very quickly a carrier of coronavirus, you should still send them to school. And that to me just seems like a recipe for spreading coronavirus really quickly. If you've got, you'd have thought that at least don't send your kid to, at least government advice should be to not send your kid to school if they've been in incredibly close contact with someone who's got coronavirus.
Herd immunity, right?
But they're saying send them to school unless they actively come down with the symptoms of coronavirus. But we also know that people are carriers of coronavirus before they display symptoms. So to me, this seems like there's a reasonable chance of that particular policy getting us to the red line, which is uncontrollable outbreak of coronavirus. I saw a bit of advice, I'm sure many people in the comments will say, well, actually, it came from this person, which is behave in such a way that you already have it. Yeah. And
so, for instance, us coming here today, us doing the show, is far more permissible than me going to visit my dad who's 65 and has asthma. So I can understand the kids thing, because, if you're acting in such a way that you already have it, the kid already has it, what would be impermissible in that situation is the child going to visit their grandparents, even if they're not displaying any symptoms. So I can see some of the rationale there, but again, that's not a sustainable way of running society for 18 months, 2 years.
The guy who said that
which is the conversation we're all avoiding. The
guy who said that was the epidemiologist from the Newsnight clip. The whole interview is actually very much worth watching. But the point there is that, they've said we're not going to cancel school because then the kids will be hanging out with the grandparents. But if you haven't done anything to actually separate grandparents from kids anyway, which they haven't,
No.
then sending kids to school, which means that all 30 of them are going to get it quite easily. And then, you know, I can see how you get a whole clusters of communities and boroughs where most families have coronavirus. I mean, with the policy as it currently seems to be written down.
Do you know the best solution to this?
What?
Basically, you get the Isle of Wight, you get like the million most sort of vulnerable people in the country, and you just sort of put them all there for like 2 years.
Well, that's what the epidemiologist was saying. He was saying ideally what we'd do is we'd put all the older and vulnerable people in the north of Scotland. It's going to be a lot more than 1 million people, though. So if you think, if you're...
I'm saying the most vulnerable.
How many people are over 70 and how many people have suppressed immune systems?
Well, suppressed immune systems, a lot of people. Anybody that's using like a steroid-based inhaler. I mean, I use Becatide. That suppresses your immune system a little bit.
Shit. Sorry, man.
It's all right.
Hope you're okay.
I hope I'm still here next week.
One more example of bootlicking journalism. This is Beth Rigby, who is political editor at Sky. This is a tweet from her yesterday in capital letters, analysis. So she's really suggesting that this is, you know, her being a critical journalist. This is what's going on. Johnson has at times been dubbed a populist, but when it comes to this pandemic, he's taking a scientific-only approach, refusing to be blown off course by other leaders' more dramatic actions. Experts do matter, and the PM's put his trust in them. Now, that is not analysis. That is repeating a government press release, or, you know, writing a government press release for them.
Or WhatsApp.
I mean, I'm not saying that it was dictated by the government, but that might as well have been written by a government press officer, because, you know, that is the impression that Boris Johnson was trying to give out when he went and did that press conference with the chief scientific advisor and the chief medical officer. But as you know, as is becoming apparent, there are lots of different scientists advising different things, and it's a political choice which one of them you decide to listen to.
Can we get that back up very quickly? By the way, if you have questions, put them in the comments with the rocket emoji. Can we just get that back up very quickly, the Beth Rigby one? Is it up? Yeah. Let's go through this line by line. I'm just going to move my mic so I can... Analysis. Johnson has at times been dubbed a populist. By who? When? Where? But when it comes to this pandemic, he's taking a scientific-only approach. How? Back that up. Refusing to be blown off course by other leaders' more dramatic actions. Who? When? Under what conditions? Obviously, in Italy, it has been more dramatic because they've got a pandemic. Experts do matter, and the PM's put his trust in them. I mean, none of those are kind of like, let's take the falsification principle here, right? You know the falsification principle, right? Whether or not a statement is true.
A statement is true only if you can falsify it.
Right. I mean, what is falsifiable about any of that? It's just gumph. It's just PR.
It is just PR. Actually, before we go, so we're going to go to your questions in a moment. First of all, for some light relief, we're going to look at some funny shit which has come out of the crisis, and also some people soiling themselves during the crisis. The first is, it's this tweet that went incredibly viral. It's kind of distasteful, but also kind of witty. I have been informed by a relative who is a middle school teacher that students are now referring to coronavirus as the boomer remover. What do you make of that, Aaron? Kind of cruel, isn't it? But
it's very cruel. Kids are cruel.
It's also it's one of those things where it's funny and cutting because it's kind of true. You know, like this is a disease which will only really take out people of that particular generation, and people with suppressed immune systems. That's we should never forget that.
And people with respiratory problems, etc. There was a story of a woman in her 30s, a doctor who died of it in the US. I think that might be wrong.
Well, it's the reason healthcare workers die from it is that you also it's not just that you have coronavirus or you don't. You have more severe coronavirus if you've been exposed to a higher viral load.
Right.
So if you spend loads and loads of time with lots of people with coronavirus, you end up absorbing a lot of it.
Because one of the most senior doctors in Lombardy died as well, didn't he?
Yeah.
Older guy.
And the guy in China, the doctor in China who first announced or first, told people that he was treating people with a novel virus, the government sort of pushed him out of his job because they didn't want people, the regional government didn't want it to get out. He ended up dying. He's now a national hero. This is Italians making the best of it. So these are, I think this is interesting in a way, because one argument the UK government have been making is that if we go to self-isolation quickly, people will get so pissed off about self-isolation that they'll just they'll come at their houses in 2 weeks, and you can only do it once because people are going to hate it so much. I'm not actually convinced that's what's going to happen. I think a lot of people, often revel in this idea of, we're all taking part in some sort of communal activity. In any case, that's what the Italians are doing. That was beautiful. Do you know the song? Do you know what song they were singing?
They were singing about Siena, their home city.
Oh, they were singing about their home city.
Yeah, Viva. You could sort of tell Viva.
Gorgeous.
Siena. No.
What do you think the song would be in Britain? Can you imagine people singing outside of their top floor windows?
There are some
down the
cities
road?
with that kind of civic pride. So, like in Liverpool, it'd be "You Never Walk Alone" would be the equivalent of that, for instance. But I think actually, this is a problem for Britain, is that it doesn't have the kind of the deep social fabric of civil society that places like Italy do. For instance, we have a much more mobile labour market. People leave where they're born to go work elsewhere. Happens less in Italy, which means that you're far less likely to have 3 or 4 generations live within a couple of square kilometres of each other. So the kinds of support networks that they can create in Italy are less likely to exist here. Again, this is all sort of
it's kind of true.
Speculative.
The only what the nudge unit did to sort of make us talk more about hand washing and wash our hands for longer was to say this thing about singing the songs. And the only 2 songs they could think of that they thought British people would all know is "Happy Birthday" and "God Save the Queen." So like there are no other sort of national songs that can bring people together. It seems like in Italy, at least regionally, that is more the case. I don't know what I'd sing in my Hackney block of flats. I don't know what the song would be that everyone in their block would know. I don't know if there would be anyone.
civic pride doesn't really. I guess Wales is different. Scotland's different. The southeast is a cultural desert, Michael.
It's true. Someone's soiling themselves. So this is, I suppose, that Italy video was the best of people responding to coronavirus. Anne Widdecombe, definitely the worst. So Anne Widdecombe claims coronavirus will be like AIDS, not as devastating as feared. Anne Widdecombe, 38 million people died. Like, what the fuck? They were gay and black, so she didn't notice.
No, it's the global south. Yeah, exactly. I was going to say these people actually doesn't give a fuck about. Wasn't there a point at one point 50% of kids in Botswana under 7 had HIV/AIDS? It was it was the definition of an epidemic. Yeah, it's it was horrific. Yeah, the idea that AIDS wasn't as bad. There were whole communities wiped out. She's getting confused with avian flu or something, or SARS. Well, she just thought. I suppose AIDS didn't come to any. She's from a particular part of the world and a particular demographic where no one she knew got AIDS. And when all the gays were dying, she was just like, meh. She's what heterosexual
what's the problem?
What's the problem? Nobody's got AIDS. Not a thing. Maybe she's an AIDS truther. I wouldn't be surprised.
She might be. There were lots of people who thought that AIDS was, God's punishment for homosexuals for sinning, which actually, I'm not going to libel Anne Widdecombe, but she's not the furthest away from that kind of
Well, Andrew Neil, who, he's the BBC's heavyweight anchorman, front of the kind of the chat, sort of the network's political offer. He was, when he was editor of the Sunday Times in the 80s was writing articles about how only gay men get HIV/AIDS. A lot of these people still think this stuff. I'm not saying he does. Again, we don't want to get, don't want to get his lawyers on us, but people in the milieus around Anne Widdecombe would have those kinds of mental presumptions.
Louis tweets on the hashtag Tisky Sour. Ireland has 90 total cases. The UK got 200 new cases today, putting the total cases at almost 800. Ireland has done so much more than the UK to combat it. Regarding schools, once one student has coronavirus, most of the school will get it. Schools must close. It's an opinion that was I kind of agree with that. Daniel Eden, will closing schools not result in lots of children being looked after by older grandparents? Now, so that's one of the main reasons that the government have said they're not going to close schools. I think it's obviously it's not a stupid idea. It is possible that if you close schools without taking any other precautionary measures, then you might end up with lots of kids going to stay with their grandparents. But So you can recognize that as a problem and say, okay, so then we're not going to close schools. Or you can recognize that as a problem and say, oh, okay, well, what are we going to have to do if we close schools, but we don't want kids to be looked after by their grandparents? Well, what do? You say you give the parents permission to have time off work, unless the parents work in an essential service, as healthcare workers or whatever. And in that case, you open the school only for people whose parents work in essential services. So in that case, you'd have less routes for infection and no extra grandparents hanging out with their kids. So yeah, it's not, what they're saying isn't a stupid idea, but the response to that doesn't need to be to not do it at all. It just means you also need some extra measures.
I mean, somebody saying, what would Michael do if I was the Prime Minister? I would implement a UBI for all at-risk persons. Basically, they'd be consigned to not leaving the house. And you'd probably have to run society at like 50%. I think a guaranteed, a universal basic income and like basically nationalizing like Uber Eats or something to send them food supplies, and in the meantime accelerate a vaccine. Other than that, I don't see what else. All the other stuff like closing down schools, etc., etc. It's kind of like it's sitting on your hands. It's doing stuff for and it makes sure that, of course, also you want to massively increase resources in the NHS, more beds, etc. It's doing stuff, but if the Harvard head of epidemiology, if the most senior figures in health are saying 40 to 70% of the global population is going to get this, that to me, if you're trying to, again, from the utilitarian perspective, minimize deaths, that seems a really rational course of action. But the stuff about schools, it just seems kind of like, it's going to slow stuff down, but I don't see how net it's going to make any big difference in terms of.
So the whole point of slowing
deaths.
it down is precisely what you want to do. If you slow it down, you have less deaths.
No, I'm saying you could say we're going to give 2.5 million people a UBI. They shouldn't leave the house.
Yeah,
I think that would cause fewer deaths.
Well, I think what you could say is, look, we're going to have a response to this which has to take into account, the costs and benefits of various courses of action. But what we're not going to be driven by is keeping the economy moving as usual, because this is an exceptional circumstance, and the main thing we value is human life. And then you say, so to do that, we're going to, as you say, take exceptional measures. We're going to give a UBI to everyone. We're going to make sure that no small businesses go bust, by sort of having a moratorium on rent or a moratorium on paying your debts or whatever, just to freeze it, have to abolish capitalism. And then say no one, at this point in time, if you work in an essential service, you have to go to work. No one else does. Yeah. And then we'll take it from there. So you take it from there, and then you might think, okay, this is, if no one's getting it, we're not going to get herd immunity, but you in a graduated way sort of start reopening society in a way that you're in control of. Because at the moment, it does just seem like, I don't see why we wouldn't be seeing an exponential increase in people who are currently infected with coronavirus without us knowing it.
I mean, maybe we've all got it. The incubation period can be very, very long.
Yeah, well, I mean, even he said 10,000 people have it, and if 10,000 people have it and we don't have much social isolation measures, I can see quite easily how by the end of next week, 20,000,
if it's exponential,
if it's exponential, it'd be 100.
I mean, that's the thing. There's very few examples. I wrote about this in the book Fully Automated Luxury Communism, paperback out in June 2020, audiobook out shortly.
Audiobook's coming out. Are you reading it?
No. But exponential. One of the few examples of exponential growth in nature is viruses. People love to talk about it with regards to Moore's law and so on. It's not a very natural phenomenon, but viruses is one of the few examples.
W. Ham says, is Britain's difference in virus management an attempt to reinforce the view that Britain has left the EU geopolitically and now culturally, scientifically? I'd say probably not. I think if you were to... So there are a number of sort of various explanations for why you could say the UK is taking a different model to the EU. And to be honest, I don't know which one of them it is. So the most sort of optimistic or the one that gives the government most credit is to say that Britain were best prepared, and so they can afford to have less disruption. And also that Britain are being led by the science instead of, taking extreme measures for, what Beth Rigby was saying. He's basically saying that, Macron is closing schools because he feels like he has to do something. So you could say, it's maybe the British are uniquely guided by the science. I mean, I'm not sure. The other idea is that potentially the British are less inclined to take more extreme actions because they put more weight behind economic growth, And the more you, as I was talking about earlier, many of the people who are going to die are economically inactive anyway. So the less restrictions you place on people's livelihoods and movements, etc., the more the economy can carry on as usual. So it could be the case that they're prioritizing economics over human life. I mean, another option is that you've got, Dominic Cummings is the chief advisor to Boris Johnson. And whilst the government are currently saying you have to listen to experts, what we know is that Dominic Cummings thinks of himself as an expert. And he gives me the impression of someone who chooses what experts he wants to listen to and ignores other people. So he's someone who famously doesn't have much respect for authority. So he often thinks that scientific consensuses are wrong. So it could it's true though. It's not a bad quality to have. So I could quite.
Well, it probably is quite a bad quality.
Well, in this case, it's a very high risk quality, right? Because it's not
that's right. Yeah. If it's a low risk thing, who cares?
To reject
your weird kooky opinion.
Exactly. To reject the scientific consent, or to reject the World Health Organization guidelines, for example. I can imagine Dominic Cummings thinking like, "Oh, these idiots at the World Health Organization, they don't have any understanding of behavioural science. I'm listening to my experts," and that. We could look back at it and say, wow, he had so much foresight and Britain's, dealt very well with this. Or we could look back at it and say, like, what the fuck was he thinking?
I mean, there's a bunch of cognitive biases at work, right? So he's like, well, I've proven the skeptics wrong over hard Brexit or no deal Brexit. We came through that. We don't need to listen. But like you say, look, you can have your kooky opinion about what's the best marinade for a ribeye steak.
Or how best to do Facebook advertising.
Yeah, I mean, that's, yeah. But this is like there's a big downside here of like several 100,000 more people would die. So it probably shouldn't be down to like your penchant for contrarianism.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and they'd say it's down to the chief medical officer and the chief scientific officer.
We don't know, right?
But they haven't subjected themselves to enough scrutiny that we can understand why it is that Britain is taking such a different approach to this than many other countries in similar situations. We're going to end it there. I've been Michael Walker. I've been with Aaron Bastani.
Thank you.
Always a pleasure to be joined by you on a Friday evening.
I love these great shows, just you and me.
They're nice, aren't they?
Yeah, I love them.
And I hope it's been informative, even though we're not epidemiologists, because as I said, I mean, you can work out quite a lot of what is going on by spending 3 days on the internet. I'm not one of those people who says, if you're not an expert, don't comment on it. I actually think that having, the whole population having a bit of general knowledge about what is going on is good for democracy. It means that you can hold people to account. Yeah, respect experts, but don't necessarily defer to them.
Yeah.
And so I think the British population becoming quite informed, understanding what's going on with coronavirus and having a bit of agency here would be a very good thing.
And if you go to support.novaramedia.com, Michael can probably start a committed coronavirus podcast, which I think is what he wants to do secretly.
It's what I've always wanted. You've been watching Tisky Sow. You've been watching Novara Media. Good night.